of war criminals.
Scores of Nazi persecutors entered the U.S.
You were a propagandist for the Nazis. Then you became an informer for the U.S. Army.
Yes.
Intelligence.
Yes.
For decades, they lived untouched by the United States government, even though there was evidence available against them.
The Immigration and Naturalization Service was supposed to be investigating Nazi persecutors, but they weren't doing a great job.
The lack of action by the Immigration Service became the subject of congressional hearings.
And by 1974, Congress pushed them on it.
Representative Elizabeth Holtzman.
Finally, I asked the immigration commissioner about this at a hearing, and I said to him, is it true that there are Nazi war criminals in the United States? And he said, yes, we have a list of alleged Nazi war criminals in this country. And I said, well, what are you doing about it? And there was silence.
In 1979, President Jimmy Carter announced a solution.
The world must never forget the lessons of the Holocaust. That is exactly the reason why I set up a special unit in the Department of Justice to root out Nazi war criminals who may be in hiding in the United States.
And so, in a dilapidated building in the middle of D.C.'s red light district on 14th Street, just above a fried chicken restaurant, a new Department of Justice Nazi hunting unit was born. And Eli Rosenbaum was there almost right at the beginning.
It took our own country nearly 30 years from when the first World War II Nazi criminal was found in the United States to finally launch in 1979 a comprehensive program to identify, investigate, and prosecute the cases.
Eli's own father had fled Nazi Germany, escaping the Holocaust. Later, he returned as part of the U.S. forces that liberated concentration camps. Now, Eli was tasked with finding the suspects who ran those camps. DOJ's Nazi hunters, officially known as the Office of Special Investigations, were investigating crimes that happened long ago, far away, with evidence in foreign languages. But the new office had a secret weapon.
Specifically for us at Justice, we had the good sense back in 1979, at the very beginning, to start hiring historians.
I talked with 4 of those historians. And these Nazi hunters, armed not with a gun and a cruiser, but a Stax pass and desk privileges at the Library of Congress, they turned out to be the key.
They have the language skills, they have the archival research skills, the interpretive skills to look at a document that might mean almost nothing to most of us, but they see a code that they recognize, a German military code like 03, what kind of officer in what unit. They know all that stuff.
They would visit dusty archives, hunched over barely legible documents, gathering Nazi personnel files. Then they would run those names against U.S. immigration records and zero in on Nazi criminals here.
These cases are usually very complex evidentiary jigsaw puzzles, and everybody plays a role in assembling the puzzle. Historians, lawyers, agents, analysts, everybody.
And it was working.
In January alone, 4 new cases entered the courtroom phase in this country.
Some of the testimony for the first time ever has been taken in the Soviet Union.
A resident of Miami is now charged with lying about his background as an SS guard at Treblinka concentration camp.
The office had a rogues gallery up on the wall, showing the faces of more than 100 former Nazis they prosecuted. But it didn't mean these Nazis were being hauled off to jail.
There was no criminal law in the United States covering crimes that were committed outside the United States by the Nazis during World War II.
It's worth repeating. The greatest crime in the 20th century was not a crime in the United States. And this led to some very frustrating moments in Eli's line of work.
In the 1990s, I questioned a suspect of ours, Jacob Reimer. He lived north of New York City and came into the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan. And by the end of the interview, under oath, he had admitted to leading a platoon of his men on a mission to, as he described it, liquidate a labor camp.
Even though he had a confession, Eli couldn't arrest him.
All we could do was bid him farewell, to go back out of the building and take Metro North home. I remember thinking if he had so much as slapped a security guard on the way in, we could get him arrested. But he had admitted to participation in genocide, mass murder, and the law just wasn't there. Just wasn't there for us. And so we were left with civil jurisdiction, revocation of citizenship, known as denaturalization and deportation.
Denaturalization and deportation. Meaning all those cases, the intricate historical investigations, the nationwide manhunts, they only resulted in immigration charges. Since Eli couldn't charge Nazis with committing atrocities, he charged them with lying on immigration paperwork. Prosecutors have a name for this.
So the Al Capone theory is near and dear to the hearts of prosecutors. It's named after the notorious gangster of the Prohibition era of the 20th century. He was a mass murderer. In the end, what the Department of Justice was able to prove was just tax evasion.
Al Capone served time in Alcatraz, but the Nazi platoon leader who told Eli he participated in the liquidation of a labor camp, that guy never saw the inside of a prison. He died while the U.S. was trying to find a country to deport him to. If this seems like an inadequate punishment to you, you're not alone.
I'd like to speak briefly on that subject.
It was also frustrating to members of Congress.
Let me just take a minute to say what is genocide. It is the most vicious, the most cruel, the most terrible crime imaginable.
By 1988, Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin had given something like 3,000 speeches pushing the U.S. to pass a genocide statute. And then, right before he retired,
the Genocide Convention Implementation Act of 1988 clears the way, at long last, for the United States to finally approve the Genocide Convention.
President Ronald Reagan signed the law criminalizing the intentional destruction of an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group.
And with its passage will end a 40-year congressional stalemate.
The U.S. was late to the Human Rights Party, but it was starting to catch up. The genocide statute created in response to the Holocaust was the first so-called substantive human rights statute. And a few years later, in the wake of atrocities in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur, Congress passed new statutes, criminal laws against torture in 1994, war crimes in 96, and the recruitment of child soldiers in 2008. The old Nazi hunting unit was reassigned to now investigate modern human rights violators. ICE started their own war crimes unit. Then the laws, the teams, and the new mandate all came together for a historic first.
This marks the first time the Department of Justice has indicted an individual with torture charges.
DOJ successfully prosecuted Charles Taylor Jr. for torture. And in 2009, a Florida judge sentenced Chucky, the son of the former Liberian president, to 97 years in federal prison. This case showed what it looks like when the U.S. uses the full force of federal law enforcement and a substantive human rights law to hold a violator accountable. But senators wanted to know, what's next?
Successful prosecution of Chucky Taylor was an important milestone, and I hope it will send a message to perpetrators of human rights abuses that the United States will not turn a blind eye towards torture and other egregious human rights violations.
At this Senate hearing called No Safe Haven, Russ Feingold pressed a top DOJ official representing the human rights section.
But it is absolutely unacceptable that this is the only human rights case that has been filed by the DOJ. It's not enough to give lip service to these principles or to simply pass laws that are never enforced. We need to make sure that these cases are aggressively and proactively investigated and prosecuted.
This hearing was back in 2009. So what has the DOJ done since? Earlier this year, I got on a video call with leaders at the Department of Justice. The old Nazi hunting unit grew into the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section. Hope Olds is their acting chief.
We are a small section made up of 25 attorneys and 5 historians with expertise in various conflicts and language abilities. We handle a variety of matters, including human rights abuse cases, as well as international violent crime and international human smuggling matters.
The government says it has leads on nearly 1,700 suspected war criminals and human rights violators inside the U.S. And I wanted to know how many of them the DOJ is pursuing. In terms of the human rights portfolio, can you tell us how many cases you all are investigating right now?
That was something I addressed.
The public affairs officer on the line interrupts. She says they can't answer that.
Because we don't discuss ongoing investigations.
I got a similar answer when I tried to ask about Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the former Sri Lankan Secretary of Defense accused of war crimes.
I'm sorry, we're not going to discuss non-public cases.
They can't discuss ongoing investigations. They can't discuss non-public cases. So I turned to the ones they can talk about. I wanted to go over the criminal, substantive statutes that are on the books. Has the U.S. ever charged someone with war crimes?
No.
Has the U.S. ever charged someone with genocide?
No.
How about the recruitment of child soldiers?
No.
And torture?
Yes.
Why has the U.S. only successfully prosecuted one person for human rights violations?
Hope, do you want to talk about how DOJ decides to bring criminal charges against human rights violators?
Can I just say?
At this point, one of the original Nazi hunters, Eli Rosenbaum, who's also on the call, jumps in.
There are been far more than one successful criminal prosecution of human rights violators. Quite a few that our office prosecuted.
Eli says the DOJ does win prosecutions against war criminals and human rights violators, just on lesser charges. That Al Capone strategy. They also wanted me to know that recently they have announced a new charge under the torture statute. It's the second one in the last 2 years. Both of those cases are pending. But still, 30 years of human rights statutes and just one conviction. Every Nazi persecutor and almost every modern-day abuser of human rights who has faced a charge has only been accused of lying on their immigration forms. And when people are deported, they sometimes rise to power in the very countries where they're accused of committing atrocities in the first place. One man, after being removed from the U.S. for using child soldiers, was then elected to the House of Representatives in Liberia. Another, who is facing lawsuits here in the U.S. over war crimes allegations, attempted a run for president of Libya. Then there's Gotabaya Rajapaksa, accused of ordering torture, murder, and mass atrocities in Sri Lanka.
You are talking all the time on the past, no? I am trying to become the president of the future Sri Lanka.
Up next, how a small group of nonprofit lawyers tries to do a government-sized job.
We sue war criminals because our government doesn't prosecute them.
That's coming up on Reveal.
Hi, my name's Catherine Miskowski, and I'm a senior reporter and producer here at Reveal. Reveal is a nonprofit news organization, and we depend on support from our listeners. Donate today at revealnews.org/donate. Thanks.
From the Center for Investigative Reporting and PRX, this is Reveal. I'm Ike Sriskandaraja, in for Al Letson. During the very first session of the very first Congress, the United States passed what would become a key to modern human rights law, though nobody knew it for about 200 years. Tucked into the Judiciary Act of 1789 was a brief provision known as the Alien Tort Statute. It was meant to provide a solution to thorny problems with unclear jurisdiction. Basically, it made it possible to sue pirates in a U.S. federal court, or any foreigner in violation of the law of nations. You could miss it if you blinked, and most did until about 1979. That's when a family who fled from Paraguay to New York learned the person they accused of torturing their son to death was also here. Some creative lawyers helped them sue this man in civil court by reincarnating that antique pirate law. And they won. A judge ruled the torturer has become like the pirate and slave trader before him, an enemy of all mankind. That precedent is the main reason why the former Sri Lankan military leader, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, could be served a lawsuit in that Trader Joe's parking lot. The family of killed journalist Lasantha Wickrematunge sued him with help from a nonprofit.
We were contacted by a representative of Lasantha's family.
Carmen Chung runs the Center for Justice and Accountability. 5 lawyers who sue alleged war criminals on behalf of the families they're accused of persecuting. And they've never lost a trial.
We've brought about 24 cases. And in those 24 cases, our clients have been awarded damages of over $700 million.
Oh my God, that's...
Yeah.
a staggering sum. But with the exception of one former Haitian death squad leader who had won the Florida lottery, those damages are almost never collected. Usually the accused don't have it, or they leave the country without paying. But Carmen says for her clients, that's not the point. They want accountability. They want closure. They want a court of law to acknowledge what happened to them. And if the criminal justice system isn't going to provide that, that's where they step in.
We sue war criminals because our government doesn't prosecute them.
Their lawsuit contains evidence about Lasantha's killing, including findings from a Sri Lankan police investigation that tracked the alleged killer's cell phones as they fled the scene of the crime.
The cell phone evidence that we've been able to obtain will forensically demonstrate that this group of assassins basically just fled into a compound that was military access only.
Police identified the alleged assassins as part of a military intelligence unit linked to other attacks on journalists, all while under the command of Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Just as Carmen's team is building the case against Rajapaksa, they learn their window to sue him in the U.S. is quickly closing. Rajapaksa, remember, is an American citizen, and Carmen's team hears that he's making one last trip to California. The rumor is he plans to renounce his U.S. citizenship so he can run for president of Sri Lanka.
And so we really saw this as our only chance to bring a case against him.
Carmen's team had been sharing information with different agencies inside the U.S. government. Federal officials knew they were tracking Rajapaksa. And then, right before they were about to serve this lawsuit, they checked back one last time.
I mean, we told them what we were doing.
With no indication that DOJ would bring charges, they moved.
We got you on tape, sir. You gotta take them. You've been served. Good job. Come on. Let's go.
Several human rights lawyers describe the same experience. They share evidence with the human rights section at DOJ, hoping their lawsuits will trigger federal investigations and criminal charges. but one of them told me it feels like passing information into a black box.
I very much empathize with that point of view.
I talked with one former DOJ prosecutor who used to work inside that black box.
I think that's probably exactly what it looks like to NGOs that are doing a lot of work